All right, last time we talked about seeing variations and seeing how things change over time, going from A through Z by incremental steps, and we can puzzle things together. But what about in our lifetime? What can we see? What proof do we have that things change, that life changes? For example, there is transient polymorphism. Now, this is when an organism has one characteristic, and due to selective pressures, they switch over to another characteristic. But if that selective pressure is removed, they revert back to the original morphology. The example given up here is the peppered moth. It is a native of England, usually rests on birch trees, and for those of you who have seen a birch tree, it's usually light and speckled. So that would mean that this morph of the moth would have a selective advantage against the other morph that sometimes comes out due to Mendelian genetics and inheritance patterns. This lighter morph would be better camouflaged against the birch tree than the darker morph. However, during the Industrial Revolution in England, well, guess what's being spewed out of smokestacks? A lot of coal, and all that dust and smoke settled on the birch trees and darkened them considerably, which makes this morph better able to survive than this one, which means that in the areas closer to the industrial zones, the selective pressure was for the darker morphology than the lighter morphology, and you saw a shift from one to the other during the Industrial Revolution. Now, when they started switching to cleaner fuel sources, or also in the countryside, when the birch trees were lighter and not polluted, the morphology still favored the original white morph. Another example is provided by Rosemary and Peter Grant, who have been studying and monitoring Galapagos finches for many decades. In 1976, there was a drought which changed the food supply available on the Galapagos Islands, and what they noticed was the parental generation in the white bars. They had a distribution of beak depth with an average around just about 9 millimeters. The next generation, those that survived during the drought, had a beak depth of roughly 9.7 millimeters. This change in the population was maintained until the drought was ended and the food supply returned to normal. Then they did notice a shift back, though it's not shown here, but a shift back to the 1976 parental distribution. These two examples show that it is possible to change the distribution of characteristics. Furthermore, humans have been changing characteristics in other organisms on a more permanent basis. A lot of time, when it's involving humans, it's artificial selection. For example, domestic breeding. Here we have your basic cow. Cows cannot survive in nature. However, they survive very well when humans take care of them. What domesticated breeding does is it takes characteristics that are desired, that the human desires, and they select the individuals that have those characteristics and breed them. This causes those characteristics to be passed on and hopefully expressed in the children, if not in the first generation. If you do it enough times, as shown by Mendelian inheritance and probability, eventually you'll probably get a breed with the characteristics that you want that is more stable and more permanent. On the dark side of that would be dog breeding. On this picture here, the dog to the left, that is an English bulldog 100 years ago. The picture to the right is a current English bulldog. Now, originally bulldogs were bred for a purpose. They were bred to fight bulls. And so this one is a functional form. However, once collectors came in, dogs were bred for a specific set of looks. And those, it doesn't matter if the dog was functional or not, they just wanted those looks. So purebred bulldogs eventually morphed by selecting for those specific characteristics into the form you see today. An example in plants would be ginkgo biloba. There are other examples such as wheat and other domesticated and agricultural crops, maize to corn, for example. I'm using ginkgo in this case just because I find it interesting, and this one has been around for over 270 million years. In fact, if you saw the other video where I showed the fossils, the plant fossils are ginkgo leaves. Now, there is only one extant species of ginkgo, of ginkgo phyta, and that would be ginkgo biloba, and it's only extant because of human cultivation. There are no ginkgos in the wild. Now, to further the artificial selection example is when I was browsing the information on ginkgo biloba yesterday, I noticed that a lot of them would spontaneously undergo polyploidy. At least the information told me so. Now, if you remember the lectures about polyploidy, if it has different ploidy, they cannot usually breed, and by the breeding definition of species, these might be considered different species. So, is it possible that humans have actually created new species of ginkgo just by cultivating them? A final example I want to present is bacteria. Now, you have all heard of antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria, and this is usually caused by human activity. The use of antibiotics will select for those individuals that have some way to counteract the antibiotics to survive it. So they're the only ones that reproduce. If they're the only ones that reproduce, their offspring will have the same resistance. And if you keep on pushing it further and further, eventually you get ones that are very, very hard to kill. Again, this isn't inadvertent, but it is due to human activity, and we have seen it within the last 100 years developing. So this shows that humans can change organisms, and within a very visible time scale. So if humans can do it, why not scale it up and leave it to random chance for nature to do it? Here's an example of variation that can be found in nature. You have here the hairy woodpecker, which is found in the Northern American continent, and you can see that it has continuous variation, and this variation is due to adaptation to local conditions. It's still considered one species, but the plumage might differ a little bit, and the size differs. This is an example of variation that can be found in nature. These are hairy woodpecker variants uh, that are found in the Northern American continent, and you can see that adjacent populations tend to have similar characteristics, so you have continuous variation throughout its range, and these variations are due to adaptation to local conditions. Now, if you have these variants and you have them breed separately for a long enough time, then they might get to a point where they get so many adaptations that they are no longer able to share and able to interbreed, and that is when you get speciation. Due to Darwin's work, we often use the Galapagos finches as an example of speciation through variation. It's believed that the Galapagos finches were originally arrived as one specific species, and over time the variants diverged to specialize towards different foods. And eventually we now have all of this range of finches, and due to accumulation of small change. What is believed to have happened to the finches is called adaptive radiation. Now, this concept is basically that you have one single species, it has variation within the species, and each of those variants are better at doing some things than others. Those that are better at getting food source A would tend to start eating food source A. Those that are better at eating food source B would go after that. And anything that is a mixture and can get both A and B tends to be selected against because they can't compete against the ones that are better adapted towards A or B. Because the original species of finch that arrived on Galapagos were pioneers in a way, they had no competition for any of the food sources, so all those variants were able to adapt towards different niches, and you had an explosion of different adaptations in adaptive radiation, which eventually led to divergence and speciation. So when you look at these finches, you could argue that they all derived from the same ancestor. They all have a head. Well, this one, let's go with this one. A head, an eye, and a beak. The beaks might differ, the shape of the head might differ slightly, but they all have the same structural features. This would be called homologous. The features might be different in some way. They might be used for different purposes, such as crushing beaks for eating seeds, or insect eaters grasping beaks, probing beaks for cactus eaters like the warbler finch. But despite the shape of the beak, they are all similar in the fact that they all probably started off in a similar ancestral state and just changed and diverged towards a speciality. If we expand this concept a little further to, say, skeletal structure, you can see in various mammalian limbs that they share similar structures. They have a humerus. Okay, I'll use this, a humerus. They have radius and ulna. Sometimes this one has lost the radius. You have the carpals and the metacarpals. All these similarities that share an ancestral commonality, an ancestral state, these are called homologous. They have the same ancestral origin, even though the limb might be used for different purposes at this time, such as wing of a bat is flying, as for the bird, whale, the forelimb is for swimming, cats and horses for standing, and humans for grasping. They are all different purposes, but they all came from the same ancestral state, same embryonic origin. However, if you have structures that perform the same function, say the wing of a bat and the wing of an insect, the embryonic origin is different, even though they do the same function, and that would be called an analogous state. So homologous, same embryonic origin, may have the same functions or may have different functions. Analogous, different embryonic origins, and have the same function.